His Excellency Mr. Kenneth Bowe, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of Jamaica. Your Excellency, Mr. Kenneth Bowe, you have the floor.
Madam President, I take the opportunity to thank the President and the people of Copenhagen and Denmark for their kind and gracious hospitality and the excellent facilities for a conference of this magnitude and importance. Climate change represents one of the most serious developmental challenges of our time. As the Prime Minister of Jamaica told Parliament last week, the danger to the planet of global warming and the catastrophes it will produce, if left unchecked, are not the alarmist warnings of overzealous scientists. It is a real danger confirmed not only by scientific evidence, but also by actual accumulated experience, unquote. We are challenged to make COP15 Copenhagen a historic landmark and turning point for global cooperation for the sake of sustained existence of our planet. It is time for a global conscience to take on board the equity and the well-being of all peoples of the world and the planet itself in response to the compelling scientific realities that are now confronting us. We acknowledge and understand the complexities and the diversities of national concerns. Consequently, transparency and trust are indispensable conditions if we are to reach an agreement with which we will all be satisfied. We are compelled by circumstances now beyond our control to come to a conclusive agreement which is binding on all of us. From the rich polluted metropolis in the north to the poor villages in Africa, from the melting glaciers in the Arctic to the eroding coastal areas of Negril and Otrius in Jamaica, it is clear that climate change knows no boundaries. It is no respecter of territory nor of economic circumstances. For small island developing states, in particular, the effects of climate change have already been considerable and in many cases catastrophic. Rising sea levels, storm surges, coastal flooding, and extreme weather patterns, including more frequent and intense hurricanes and prolonged droughts, have increased the environmental vulnerabilities that we face. The impact on our economic and social development through the effects on trade, tourism, destruction of physical infrastructure, and population displacement highlight the grave physical and financial costs associated with climate change. Madam President, it is for these reasons that the international community must collectively demonstrate the necessary resolve and break new ground to achieve a fair, balanced, and just agreement in the shortest possible time. As the most vulnerable to the catastrophic impacts of climate change, Jamaica and its partners in the Alliance of Small Island Developing States are compelled to be emphatic in our demands for a legal, binding, verifiable, and enforceable agreement. An agreement that substantially reduces greenhouse gas concentrations, lowers limits on temperature rise, establishes an earlier peaking point, and makes provision for adequate funding to enable developing countries to adapt to climate change without compromising our path to development. A number of actions and measures must be taken if there is any hope of deterring human-induced climate change. First, industrialized countries who owe a historic debt for carbon emissions must take the lead and make commitments for quantifiable and time-specific cuts and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% in respect of 1990 levels by 2020 and by 85% by 2050. We must limit temperature rise to well below 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and long-term stabilization of greenhouse gas concentration to below 350 parts per million. It is important that all major emitters play a role in climate change mitigation while taking account of their development needs. We urge major developing countries to undertake the necessary actions aimed at reducing their emissions. Secondly, adaptation measures are required to enable and support developing countries to respond and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. Thirdly, the introduction and transfer of appropriate technologies to facilitate action by developing countries to effectively pursue mitigation and adaptation measures. Fourthly, capacity building to enable developing countries to participate fully in national and international processes to prepare and implement climate change actions and to pursue carbon-free and low-carbon emission technologies for its continued growth. Finally, we welcome the announcement of Fast Start funding of $10 billion per annum up to 2012. Much more substantial funding will, however, be required to arrest the threat posed by global warming. We believe that priority attention must be given to the most vulnerable countries, in particular, small island developing states. In the case of Jamaica, we are a low emitter of greenhouse gases. Nevertheless, Jamaica is committed to taking action at the national level to conserve energy and explore opportunities for utilizing renewable energy sources. Jamaica already has in place a wind farm which contributes to our energy needs. A new energy policy is also being formulated to include the diversifying of our sources of energy to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. The aim is for renewable energy to provide no less than 20% of our energy mix by the year 2030. We must close the gap between scientific reality and the pledges being made by establishing clear benchmarks based on irrefutable and unambiguous findings of the world's preeminent scientists and research groups, and measure our collective and individual responses against that reality and those standards. We must know and acknowledge that unattended gaps will become increasingly costly over time. If we fail to signal to the world that global governance is effectively charting a course which leads to mitigation of climate change with equity and fairness for all nations, then global insecurity will be the outcome. Displacement of peoples, instability and confrontation, food and nutritional insecurity are among the outcomes we fear. During this conference, Madam President, we have heard the eloquence and the passion of our young people from across the globe and their earnest and justifiable pleas that we take the necessary actions to ensure that we bequeath to them a planet that is safe and environmentally secure. Let us not fail them. I thank you, Madam President.